The Mediterranean sun hung low on the horizon, its golden light shimmering across the waves near Cape Bon. The date was April 18, 1943. For many German crews aboard slow-moving Junkers transports, the flight back to Sicily felt routine, almost peaceful. Engines droned, propellers chopped the air, and weary men gazed at the endless blue sea below. They were carrying not only supplies but also doctors, mechanics and wounded comrades, lifelines for a collapsing front in North Africa. But peace in war is a fragile illusion. High above, hidden by distance and the glare of the late afternoon sun, American pilots of the 57th Fighter Group tightened formation. Radios crackled with clipped instructions. They knew exactly what was about to unfold. Every flight detail of the German formation had already been compromised, every route exposed, every schedule tracked. This was not chance, it was design. Within minutes, the calm skies over Cape Bon would erupt into one of the most lopsided battles of the Second World War. Dozens of transports, slow, vulnerable, packed with men, would fall from the sky in a fiery storm. German pilots would look on in disbelief as the very foundation of their supply network disintegrated before their eyes. And American flyers, many scarcely out of their 20s, would write themselves into the grim legend of air combat. How could so much destruction happen in just 15 minutes? Why were Germany's best doctrines and most experienced airmen powerless to prevent it? And how did an aircraft often dismissed as outdated, the P-40 Warhawk, become the spearhead of an air massacre that would echo through history? Tonight, we'll peel back the layers of strategy, technology, and human experience that converged in those fatal moments. We'll hear how intelligence breakthroughs set the stage, how tactics turned precision into slaughter, and how shockwaves from this single afternoon stretched from Tunisia to Berlin. But remember, this story is not just about planes and numbers. It's about men, transport crews clutching controls with trembling hands, fighter escorts torn between duty and survival, and American pilots executing a mission that left them both triumphant and unsettled. For in victory lay a haunting truth: modern war had become industrial, impersonal, and devastatingly efficient. If you are fascinated by the turning points of World War II, the moments when strategies collapsed, when assumptions shattered, when the course of history bent in minutes, you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss these forgotten stories of courage, desperation, and innovation. If you find yourself drawn into this tale, hit the like button and share it with others who love history as much as you do. And as you listen, think about this question. What does it mean when a battle is decided not by bravery alone, but by preparation, intelligence, and overwhelming design? Stay with me. The massacre over Cape Bon is about to begin. The spring of 1943 was a season of collapse for Axis forces in North Africa. The grand dreams of Hitler and Mussolini, of a Mediterranean dominated by the Reich and its ally, had shriveled into a desperate last stand in Tunisia. From the east, the seasoned divisions of General Montgomery's 8th Army pressed westward, pushing remnants of the Afrika Korps out of Libya. From the west, newly strengthened American forces advanced from Algeria, their confidence reborn after recovering from the bloody lessons of Kasserine Pass. By April, Axis troops, German and Italian alike, were trapped in a tightening vice. But the desert, for all its unforgiving heat and barren expanse, was not their deadliest enemy. Their most pressing danger was isolation. With Allied navies and air power now strangling the Mediterranean, the once thriving Axis supply lines had withered. Convoys from Italy risked annihilation from submarines and aircraft operating out of Malta. Losses mounted so heavily that sea supply was no longer viable. And so, the burden fell on the Luftwaffe's aging transport fleet. Central to this effort was the Junkers Ju-52, a sturdy trimotor transport that had carried German troops across Europe since the Spanish Civil War. It was slow, vulnerable, and hopelessly outdated by 1943 standards. Yet it remained the workhorse of the Luftwaffe, ferrying fuel, ammunition, and men across the short but deadly stretch between Sicily and Tunisia. Each flight carried not only material lifelines but also hope, the hope that the beleaguered Axis forces could hold out until relief arrived. The Luftwaffe devised methods to protect these precious runs. Transports often skimmed the sea, flying just above the waves to evade radar and complicate interception. Experienced Messerschmitt Bf 109 escorts flew above, ready to pounce on any Allied intruders. Formations were tight, disciplined, and sometimes massive, stretching for miles across the sky. For the Axis, this aerial bridge was as vital as any road or port. Without it, North Africa would fall. But what the Germans did not realize was that their lifeline had already been compromised. Far away in the quiet huts of Bletchley Park in England, British codebreakers were unraveling the secrets of the Enigma machine. Every schedule, every dispatch, every order regarding transport flights was being read, sometimes within hours of transmission. The Allies knew when the convoys would fly, how many aircraft would be present, even what their escorts would look like. This intelligence goldmine fed directly into an operation the Allies codenamed Flax. Its purpose was simple but ruthless: to choke the Axis aerial supply chain until it suffocated. American and British squadrons were briefed not merely to patrol but to hunt. They would wait, invisible in the sky, until the lumbering transports appeared, and then fall upon them with precision. Among those squadrons stood the 57th Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Its men were young, some barely out of training, but by 1943 they had learned the hard lessons of desert warfare. Flying the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a fighter often dismissed by German intelligence as obsolete, they had adapted the aircraft to Mediterranean conditions. Guns were harmonized for maximum effect at short range, engines fine-tuned for bursts of power, and tactics drilled again and again in practice attacks against mock transport formations. They knew that one day they would be called upon to strike a decisive blow. The British, too, prepared their contribution. The pilots of No. 92 Squadron, Royal Air Force, flew sleek Spitfires, tasked not with destroying transports but with keeping German escorts busy in the upper sky. It would be a deadly ballet, Warhawks diving into the vulnerable bellies of lumbering transports while Spitfires tangled with Messerschmitts above. Coordination was everything. April 18, 1943 began like so many other days of war. In the Sicilian airfields, German crews loaded fuel drums, ammunition crates, and wounded soldiers into the holds of their Ju-52s. Mechanics checked engines worn from constant flights. Pilots reviewed maps of the Cape Bon route, a corridor that had already claimed so many of their comrades. They had faith in their escorts, in the rigid discipline of Luftwaffe formations, and in the distance they hoped would shield them from surprise. On the other side of the sea, American pilots gathered around briefing boards. Intelligence officers laid out the plan. A German formation was expected in the afternoon, heading back toward Sicily. They knew the time, the altitude, the numbers. The pilots listened in silence, aware that this mission might be unlike any other. For once, the odds were tilted in their favor. One of those pilots later recalled, "It wasn't going to be a dogfight. It was going to be a slaughter if we did it right." His words carried no bravado, only the weight of inevitability. The stage was set. Over the brilliant blue waters of the Mediterranean, where sunlight shimmered like a painter's brush across the waves, two forces approached each other. One, a desperate convoy of transports and escorts, believing in their mission, unaware of the trap. The other, a disciplined cadre of Allied fighters, poised to strike with knowledge that their prey was already doomed. In just a few hours, Cape Bon would witness a battle so swift, so devastating, that German commanders would refuse to believe the reports at first. They would dismiss them as exaggerations, as rumors. But the truth would be undeniable. In the span of barely 15 minutes, the Luftwaffe's lifeline to North Africa would be severed, and the legend of the Palm Sunday Massacre would be born. The afternoon of April 18, 1943, carried an air of deceptive calm. Over the Mediterranean, the sunlight sparkled against the sea like shattered glass, and from Sicily the horizon seemed endless. To the Luftwaffe crews preparing their transports, it felt like another routine mission. The Allies had intercepted some convoys in the past, but discipline and courage had brought many safely through. Few of those pilots could have imagined how narrow the margin for survival had become. At approximately 1,500 hours, the formation lifted off. 65 Junkers Ju-52 transports climbed slowly into the Sicilian sky, their three engines coughing and rattling before settling into the familiar drone that echoed across the airfield. These aircraft were old, patched from years of service, their fuselages bearing scars of previous campaigns, from Spain to Crete, from Russia to the deserts of Libya. But age did not matter. They carried the supplies that 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia depended upon. Inside the transports, the atmosphere was cramped and hot. Wooden crates filled with ammunition and fuel drums shared space with stretchers carrying wounded soldiers. Some aircraft had technicians, mechanics, or staff officers, men whose skills were far more valuable than rifles. The crews knew that their mission was vital, yet each looked to the Messerschmitt fighters escorting them for reassurance. 4 squadrons of Bf-109s had been assigned to guard the convoy, about 15 aircraft in all. They were veterans of the Desert War, men with dozens of kills to their names. Their machines gleamed with desert camouflage, their noses painted yellow in the style of the Luftwaffe in North Africa. Alongside them flew a handful of twin-engine Bf-110 heavy fighters, slower but heavily armed. For the Germans it seemed enough. The enemy, after all, would have to find them first. What they did not know was that the Allies had already found them. Miles away, circling high above Tunisia, the pilots of the US 57th Fighter Group were already in position. 47 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks formed 3 squadrons, their shark-mouthed noses cutting menacing profiles against the sun. With them flew 12 RAF Spitfires, soaring at 15,000 feet, invisible specks against the glare. The plan was simple. The Spitfires would engage the escorts, drawing them into combat above, while the P-40s dove upon the transports below. It was a textbook ambush, designed with precision and aided by intelligence that had stripped away every shred of German secrecy. The Warhawks circled at 4,000 feet, waiting. Their engines hummed steadily, throttled back to conserve fuel. Each pilot scanned the sea below, nerves taut, adrenaline surging. Training had prepared them for this moment, but training could never replicate the gravity of reality. Somewhere below, lumbering shapes would soon appear, and with them, the opportunity to cripple the Axis in North Africa. At 15:10, the formation came into view. From above, the Ju-52s looked like a flock of giant birds skimming the sea, their silver-gray wings glinting in the afternoon sun. They flew in tight V-shaped groups, 6 or 7 to a wedge, all part of a greater mass that stretched across the sky. The transports kept their altitude low, sometimes just 100 feet above the water, believing this would keep them safe from radar detection and surprise attack. To the Allied pilots peering down from altitude, however, this low flight only made them easier targets. Against the blue-green sea, the German machines were clear as silhouettes in a shooting gallery. The American commander gave the signal. The first squadron of P-40s tipped their noses down. Gravity pulled them into a screaming dive, sunlight flashing off their wings as they descended in near silence. Below, in the transports, few noticed the threat until it was too late. One German gunner, peering through his side window, glimpsed specks growing rapidly larger in the sky above. He shouted a warning, but already the American fighters were upon them. The escorts reacted instantly. The Bf-109s clawed for altitude, trying to intercept the diving Warhawks. But the very act of climbing drained their fuel and left the transports vulnerable. It was the precise dilemma the Allies had anticipated. If the fighters stayed low, they would be massacred from above. If they climbed, they abandoned the very aircraft they were meant to protect. In the chaos of those first seconds, the Luftwaffe commander made his choice. He ordered his escorts to engage the attackers, gambling that their skill and speed could buy the transports time. Messerschmitts arced upward, guns blazing, heading straight into the path of the circling Spitfires. The trap had closed. The Spitfires pounced. Dogfights erupted at 15,000 feet, spirals of smoke and tracer fire streaking across the sky. German pilots fought with desperation, rolling and diving in an attempt to break free, but the Spitfires were waiting for this very moment. They matched the Messerschmitts turn for turn, forcing them into duels that dragged them higher and farther from the convoy below. Meanwhile, the Warhawks fell upon the transports. Machine guns chattered as streams of .50 caliber fire ripped into the aluminum skins of the Ju-52s. Entire sections of fuselage shredded under the impact, fuel drums igniting into fireballs. Some transports disintegrated instantly, scattering wreckage into the sea below. Others staggered on, trailing smoke and flames, only to plunge moments later into the waves. Inside, crew and passengers fired pistols and rifles from windows in a desperate but futile gesture of resistance. One American pilot described the scene years later. They were like sitting ducks. We came in, picked our target, and fired. The transports couldn't run, couldn't maneuver. We hit them and they just went down. From the ground and sea, Italian fishermen and coastal observers watched in horror as the sky turned into a killing field. Black smoke spiraled upward, and the Mediterranean became littered with burning debris. For the Luftwaffe crews, it was carnage unlike anything they had experienced. Within minutes, the Palm Sunday Massacre was underway. The first wave of P-40s tore through the German formation like blades through silk. Each pilot had chosen his target in the seconds before the dive, eyes locked, fingers tight on the trigger. At 300 yards they opened fire. 6 streams of .50 caliber slugs converged with lethal precision. A Ju-52 at the edge of the convoy shuddered as its engines coughed flame, wings folding as it crashed into the sea. Another erupted in midair, scattering fragments that glittered in the sun before vanishing into the waves. The sound inside the transports was deafening. Bullets punched through aluminum with sharp cracks, ricocheting inside like steel hail. Crewmen screamed warnings over the roar of engines, but their voices were drowned out by gunfire. Gunners in dorsal turrets swung their 13mm machine guns upward, spitting bursts at the attackers. Yet their arcs of fire were limited, their ammunition meager, and their targets impossibly fast. In one Ju-52, a German medical orderly tried to shield the wounded men lying on stretchers. Bullets ripped through the fuselage, striking crates, shredding canvas, spraying splinters. The aircraft bucked as its right wing tore open. Seconds later, it rolled and plunged nose first into the water, vanishing in a plume of spray. The Americans attacked with methodical rhythm. One squadron swooped down, fired, and pulled away. Another followed immediately, keeping constant pressure on the convoy. Warhawks dived, fired, then climbed again for altitude, circling back like hawks circling prey. Their shark-toothed noses seemed almost symbolic of their role, predators feeding on the helpless below. Above, the escorts fought a battle they could not win. The Spitfires had the advantage of altitude, position, and coordination. Messerschmitts darted and rolled, their cannon fire streaking across the sky. A Spitfire spiraled downward trailing smoke, but for every Allied loss, another German fighter fell. The Bf-109s could not disengage to save the transports, they were too heavily pressed. Every minute, their dwindling fuel reserves ticked away. On the deck below, the massacre continued. Some transports attempted desperate maneuvers. A few broke formation, turning sharply in hopes of escape. Yet isolation only made them easier targets. A Warhawk pilot described one such moment. "I saw a Ju-52 peel away trying to hug the coastline. I rolled in behind him, closed the distance and fired. He went into the cliffs before he even had a chance to ditch." Others tried to climb, hoping altitude might save them. It was a fatal error. Laden with cargo, the Ju-52s climbed sluggishly, their engines straining. P-40s simply followed them upward, their guns chewing through wings and tailplanes until the transports toppled back toward the sea. The air was filled with fire and smoke, tracer rounds streaking like red comets across the sky. Pilots described the smell of burning fuel, the flash of explosions, the strange contrast of horror and mechanical precision. In the chaos, time seemed to stretch and collapse. To some, the battle felt endless. To others, it passed in an instant. For the German escort pilots, frustration mounted to despair. They could see their charges being slaughtered below, yet they were powerless to intervene. Every attempt to dive back into the melee meant leaving their own flanks open to Spitfires. Several did dive, desperate to protect the transports, only to be bounced and shot down themselves. Survivors later recalled the helplessness of hearing their radios fill with calls for help while being locked in battles they could not escape. One German pilot wrote in his diary after the war, "We were not fighting men that day. We were fighting fate itself. No matter what we did, the Americans had us." The destruction was merciless. Some transports caught fire in midair, blazing like torches before plunging into the waves. Others, riddled with bullets, tried to ditch on the water, their fuselages breaking apart on impact. Survivors clung to floating debris as oil fires spread across the sea's surface. Italian fishing boats and German naval patrols would later rescue some, but many slipped beneath the waves unnoticed. For the Americans, the scene was surreal. Pilots described transports bursting apart beneath their gunfire, pieces of wings and fuselage flying past their cockpits. Yet there was little sense of triumph. More often they felt grim determination, the cold focus of men completing a mission. As one pilot recalled, it wasn't about glory. It was about doing the job. You saw a target, you fired, you moved on. There wasn't time to think. In barely 15 minutes the outcome was sealed. 24 Ju-52s were confirmed destroyed. Another 35 limped away with severe damage, many never to fly again. At least 9 Bf-109s and 1 Bf-110 were shot down. On the Allied side, the price was 7 aircraft, 6 P-40s and 1 Spitfire. For the Luftwaffe, the disparity was staggering. When the last surviving transports broke for Sicily, smoke still hung in the air over Cape Bon. The Mediterranean was strewn with wreckage, oil slicks, and the faint cries of men clinging to rafts. Allied fighters regrouped, counting their squadrons, radioing in confirmation of victory. For them, the mission had been executed with devastating efficiency. For the Germans, it was a catastrophe. The massacre was over, but its consequences were only beginning. When the smoke cleared over Cape Bon, the full scale of the disaster slowly came into focus. Allied pilots returned to their bases, engines still hot, guns empty, adrenaline fading. For them, the tally spoke for itself. Dozens of German transports destroyed, escorts scattered, and only a handful of Allied losses. It had been brutal, almost mechanical, and it was over before many fully realized what had happened. In the German ranks, the picture was far darker. Of the 65 transports that had set out, 24 were confirmed destroyed in the engagement. Another 35 limped back to Sicily or coastal fields with bullet-riddled fuselages, leaking fuel, shattered landing gear, and wounded crew. Many of those damaged aircraft never flew again, grounded permanently by damage too severe for hasty repair. The escorting fighters had fared no better. 9 Bf-109s and a Bf-110 were gone, their pilots killed or captured. The human cost was staggering. Records indicate that at least 20 aircrew were killed outright, 28 wounded, and more than 50 missing. But those numbers tell only part of the story. Each transport carried not just pilots and gunners but passengers, mechanics, medics, administrators, clerks, and wounded soldiers being evacuated. Many of those men vanished without trace, their names unrecorded, their fates sealed by the sea. For the Luftwaffe, it was not only aircraft that had been lost, but the irreplaceable experience of technicians and specialists upon whom whole units depended. On the beaches of Sicily, wrecks washed ashore, their wings crumpled, their cargo scattered. Survivors staggered from the surf, coughing seawater, eyes glazed with shock. Rescue boats pulled men from oil-slicked waters, their uniforms blackened with smoke and fuel. Some were silent, too dazed to speak. Others sobbed openly, clutching at comrades as though refusing to let go of life itself. Word of the disaster spread quickly through Luftwaffe channels. At headquarters in Rome, initial reports were met with disbelief. Officers suspected exaggeration or confusion in the heat of battle. Could so many transports really have been destroyed in a single encounter? But as radio transmissions came in from multiple surviving crews, and as naval patrols confirmed debris scattered across the Mediterranean, the truth became undeniable. General Albert Kesselring, overall commander in the Mediterranean, was among the first to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. His war diary for that day was unusually brief, stripped of embellishment. Daylight transport operations have become impossible. Night operations only until further notice. It was the statement of a professional soldier confronted by the collapse of an entire logistical lifeline. In Berlin, Hitler's reaction was predictably furious. He railed against the escort commanders for alleged cowardice, accused transport pilots of abandoning their duty, and demanded immediate courts-martial. None of these accusations matched reality. The men had fought bravely in impossible circumstances, but anger often overruled logic at the Reich's highest level. Orders were issued to reinforce the Mediterranean air arm, though everyone knew the resources no longer existed to do so. The Luftwaffe transport fleet, already stretched thin by campaigns across multiple fronts, could not absorb such losses. Each Ju-52 destroyed represented not just an airframe but years of accumulated experience in its crew. Pilots of transports were not easily replaced. They required hundreds of hours of training, familiarity with navigation, formation flying, and emergency procedures. In 1943, Germany could not produce such replacements at speed. The losses were permanent. For the frontline troops in Tunisia, the consequences were immediate. The supply line they depended upon had been severed. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and rations had been dwindling even before the massacre. Now, with daylight transport flights suspended, those shortages would accelerate into crisis. Axis soldiers facing British and American offensives soon realized that the flow of supplies upon which they relied had slowed to a trickle. Palm Sunday had condemned them to isolation. Yet beyond material consequences lay something less tangible but equally devastating: morale. The Luftwaffe had cultivated an aura of invincibility since the earliest days of the war. German soldiers had grown accustomed to seeing the Black Cross dominate the skies. But over Cape Bon that myth was shattered. Veterans spoke later of the disbelief that rippled through their units. If the Luftwaffe could not protect its own transports in daylight, what hope was there of stopping the bombers that increasingly threatened Germany itself? For the Americans, the victory brought both satisfaction and unease. The pilots of the 57th Fighter Group had performed with extraordinary precision, achieving one of the most lopsided victories in air warfare. Yet many carried conflicted feelings. Shooting down transports laden with helpless passengers lacked the glamour of dueling enemy aces. One pilot admitted years later, "It was necessary, but it felt like slaughter. Those planes couldn't escape and we cut them down." But war rarely affords comfort. The destruction of the German convoy was not an act of cruelty, but of strategy. By crippling Axis supply to Tunisia, the Allies accelerated the collapse of enemy resistance in North Africa. Each transport destroyed meant fewer bullets fired at American soldiers, fewer mines laid against advancing tanks, fewer rations for defenders clinging to their last positions. The slaughter in the skies translated directly into lives saved on the ground. News of the massacre filtered into Allied press within days. American newspapers ran headlines boasting of the extraordinary victory. Easter egg hunt over Tunisia, one report quipped, pairing triumph with light-hearted metaphor. Yet behind the headlines lay sober recognition. The battle had exposed not just weakness in the Luftwaffe, but the emerging dominance of American air power. For the Luftwaffe, Palm Sunday became a symbol of everything going wrong. The era when German aircraft had roamed Europe at will was gone. Their enemies now possessed the tools of systematic, industrialized destruction, tools that could not be matched by courage alone. In the days that followed, German commanders reluctantly shifted transport operations to nighttime only, a move that reduced efficiency and strained pilots with exhausting schedules. The psychological impact extended beyond the Mediterranean. Officers on the Eastern Front, hearing of the massacre, questioned whether their own supply lines might one day suffer the same fate. In the Reich itself, whispers spread among civilians. If the Luftwaffe could not protect its own transports, how could it protect German cities from the bombers that came night after night? Palm Sunday was more than a tactical defeat. It was a revelation of vulnerability. The Luftwaffe had been pierced through the heart, and for the first time, even the most loyal officers began to wonder if the war was winnable at all. The Palm Sunday Massacre was shocking in its suddenness, but it did not occur in isolation. It was one dramatic clash within a larger Allied effort, an operation designed to suffocate the Axis presence in North Africa by severing the last lifeline of supply. That effort carried the codename Operation Flax, and in many ways it was the blueprint for modern air interdiction. By early April 1943, the situation for the Axis in Tunisia had become untenable. On the ground, Erwin Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps was now trapped between two converging Allied armies. To the east, General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army pushed westward after victories at El Alamein and across Libya. To the west, American and French forces pressed east from Algeria, learning quickly from earlier setbacks. Axis troops, German and Italian alike, were cornered along the Tunisian coast, with the Mediterranean at their back and Allied armies at their front. For 250,000 men, survival hinged on supply. But the Mediterranean sea routes had become perilous. British submarines and American aircraft from Malta prowled the waters, sinking Axis shipping at rates Germany could no longer sustain. What had once been a steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and food now trickled through sporadically, with each convoy paying a heavy price. That left only the skies. The Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica were tasked with the monumental job of ferrying supplies from Sicily to Tunisia using every available aircraft. The backbone of this effort was the Junkers Ju-52, a trimotor transport that had been the workhorse of German logistics since the 1930s. Slow, ungainly, and lightly armed, the Ju-52 was ill-suited for contested skies, but necessity left no alternative. Alongside them flew Italian SM.82 transports and on occasion, the massive Me-323 Gigant, a 6-engine behemoth capable of hauling 12 tons of cargo. These flights were perilous but essential. Every sack of flour, every drum of fuel, every crate of ammunition kept Axis soldiers fighting a little longer. To safeguard these lifelines, German commanders devised tactics they believed could succeed. Flights operated at extremely low altitude, sometimes skimming just 50 feet above the waves, to avoid radar detection. Escorts from elite fighter units like JG-27 and JG-53 accompanied them, veterans hardened by years of desert warfare. Timing was varied, routes were changed, and formations were flown tight to maximize defensive firepower. But all these precautions were meaningless in the face of Allied intelligence. At Bletchley Park in England, codebreakers were reading German communications in near real time. Thanks to ultra-intercepts, Allied planners knew when the transports would take off, how many there would be, their cargo, and even the number of escorts. It was as if the Axis had handed the Allies a detailed playbook for every mission. Armed with this knowledge, Allied commanders devised Operation Flax. The objective was clear: destroy the aerial lifeline keeping the Afrika Korps alive. The method would be systematic, relentless interception of transport convoys over the Mediterranean, using fighters staged from forward bases in Tunisia. American squadrons, particularly the 57th Fighter Group, drilled specifically for this role. Flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, they practiced diving attacks on large, lumbering formations of transports. Gun harmonization was adjusted for maximum damage at 250 yards, ideal for tearing into thin-skinned cargo planes. RAF Spitfires were assigned as top cover, tasked with engaging the inevitable German fighter escorts. Every detail was refined: fuel loads, ammunition mixtures of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, and even communication protocols. Nothing was left to chance. The results were devastating. Palm Sunday was the most dramatic clash, but it was only one in a series of blows that spanned April. On April 5, the Allies destroyed 14 Ju-52s. On April 10, another 20 were brought down. On April 19, the day after Palm Sunday, South African pilots intercepted 16 Italian SM.82 transports and shot down every one. The climax came on April 22, when American fighters struck a formation of Me-323 Gigants. Out of 16 massive aircraft, 14 were destroyed, their colossal frames erupting in flames and crashing into the sea. Each Gigant had been carrying desperately needed fuel. The loss was catastrophic. In less than 3 weeks, Operation Flax eliminated more than 100 Axis transports. To put that number in perspective, Germany had entered 1943 with only a few hundred long-range transports in total, spread across multiple theaters. Many of the aircraft lost in the Mediterranean could never be replaced. The Luftwaffe's transport arm, already overextended, was crippled. The losses went beyond machines. Each transport carried not only cargo but also experienced crews and often passengers, technicians, administrators, and medics. These men were specialists whose skills could not be easily replaced. Their deaths hollowed out the Luftwaffe's ability to function as a modern air force. As one German officer admitted after the war, "We did not just lose planes. We lost the men who made the planes useful." The consequences for the Axis in Tunisia were immediate and severe. Without adequate resupply, fuel shortages paralyzed armored units. Artillery pieces fell silent for lack of shells. Soldiers' rations dwindled, leaving men weak and demoralized. Wounded soldiers could no longer be evacuated effectively, overwhelming field hospitals. What had once been an army capable of fluid desert maneuvers became a starving, undersupplied force clinging to defensive positions. By mid-April, Kesselring knew the truth: the Afrika Korps could not hold. The Palm Sunday Massacre and the broader Operation Flax campaign had done what months of ground fighting could not. They had cut the arteries of Axis logistics. When the final collapse came on May 13, 1943, with over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendering in Tunisia, many historians traced the beginning of the end back to those April skies. Without Operation Flax, the Axis might have prolonged the fight for months. With it, their fate was sealed in weeks. And yet, perhaps the most enduring lesson of Operation Flax was not about Tunisia at all, but about the future of warfare. For the first time, air power had shown its ability to decide the outcome of an entire campaign, not by bombing cities or supporting ground troops, but by strangling an enemy's logistics from above. It was a preview of strategies that would echo throughout the rest of the 20th century. Palm Sunday was the symbol, but Operation Flax was the execution. Together, they marked the death knell of the Luftwaffe's transport arm and accelerated the end of the Axis dream in North Africa. The Palm Sunday Massacre was remembered by many as a sudden storm of fire and metal, but in truth, its roots lay far deeper than the 15 minutes of destruction above Cape Bon. What happened that afternoon was not simply an ambush, nor just a stroke of luck for the Americans. It was the inevitable outcome of years of preparation on one side and years of erosion on the other. For the men who fought it, the difference could be measured in hours in the cockpit, in the reliability of a radio, in the supply lines that stretched back across oceans. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had stunned the world with its disciplined, highly trained aviators. Pilots of 1939 and 1940 had cut their teeth in Spain and polished their craft over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But by 1943, that polished machine had begun to rust. Shortages of fuel meant young cadets could barely log a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors once enjoyed. Training programs, once rigorous, were abbreviated and rushed. Veteran instructors were pulled from classrooms and sent back to combat units, leaving recruits with less guidance and fewer opportunities to practice. Aircraft once meant for training were pressed into active service. The result was unmistakable. Young Luftwaffe pilots were reaching the front lines with a mere 80 hours of total flying time. 80 hours? Barely enough to master the basics, hardly enough to prepare for the brutal realities of air combat. The Americans who faced them on Palm Sunday came from an entirely different background. They had trained over the wide skies of the United States, with fuel and time in abundance. Each pilot arriving in the Mediterranean theater had already logged 300 to 400 hours before ever meeting an enemy. They had practiced dogfights, navigation, long-range patrols, and squadron maneuvers until they became second nature. By the time they strapped into their P-40s for that fateful intercept, they were not experimenting or learning on the job, they were executing routines they had rehearsed again and again. That preparation revealed itself in the skies above Cape Bon, where American formations dove in perfect coordination, broke cleanly, and returned for attack after attack with mechanical precision. To the Germans, it felt like being struck by a tide that never lost rhythm. And training was only part of the story. Technology also tilted the balance. On paper, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 could outperform the American Curtiss P-40 Warhawk in climb rate and high-altitude agility. German pilots had often boasted that the P-40 was outdated, a relic suited only for secondary theaters. Yet in Tunisia, the situation was reversed. The Warhawk had been adapted for Mediterranean combat, its supercharger modified, its 6 heavy .50 caliber machine guns harmonized for maximum lethality at the range where transports were most vulnerable. Against the thin aluminum skin of the lumbering Ju-52s, a single burst tore engines apart and set fuel tanks ablaze. For German crews, the suddenness of destruction was shocking. One moment a transport was holding steady in formation, the next it was disintegrating in smoke and flame, falling into the sea. But perhaps the most decisive technological edge was not in the guns, nor even the engines, it was in the radios. Every American pilot had a working, reliable radio. Orders, warnings, and tactical adjustments flowed instantly from leader to wingman. Attacks were not individual duels but coordinated strikes, each squadron acting as one. The Germans, by contrast, had long struggled with unreliable sets and limited communication protocols. Escorts often fought blind, cut off from one another, unable to organize a unified defense. While Spitfires tangled with the Messerschmitts above, American P-40s below tore into the transports with systematic, devastating precision. What for the Germans was chaos, for the Americans was choreography. Yet beneath training and technology lay another weapon, less visible but equally decisive: logistics. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, pouring forth planes, parts, and fuel at a scale unmatched in history. In the dust and heat of North Africa, American ground crews kept the fighters of the 57th Group in top condition. Engines were serviced, weapons harmonized, fuel tanks filled. Every pilot who took off on April 18 could be sure his machine was ready. Spare parts were plentiful, ammunition never in short supply, and replacements already on the way. Warhawks lost in battle would be replaced within days. There was always more behind them. For the Germans, the picture could not have been more different. Fuel was rationed and often scarce. Spare parts had to be salvaged from wrecks. Every transport destroyed over Tunisia was not just a tactical loss, it was an irreplaceable blow. Factories could no longer keep up with demand, and the seas were blocked by Allied submarines and aircraft. Every Ju-52 shot down over the Mediterranean represented not only the lives on board, but also years of accumulated flight experience, technical expertise, and a hole in the fragile supply network that could not be filled. For all their valor, German pilots were flying within a shrinking cage of resources. This imbalance gave the battle its particular character. German transport crews fought bravely, some firing rifles or pistols out of side windows in desperate resistance. Escort pilots dove into combat knowing their fuel would barely last. The courage of those men is beyond doubt. But courage alone cannot shift the weight of preparation, technology, and supply. Palm Sunday was not decided in that quarter of an hour. It had been decided long before in the flight schools, the factories, and the shipping routes of two nations. It was the culmination of a system built for endurance, crushing one that had already begun to hollow out. To the Germans who survived, it seemed almost impossible. How could so many aircraft fall so quickly? To the Americans, it was proof that their way of war worked. They had been taught to fight as a team, to trust their machines, to rely on method rather than improvisation. Critics had mocked this approach as mechanical, soulless. Yet here, over the blue waters of the Mediterranean, it was precisely that method that delivered overwhelming victory. And Palm Sunday was not an exception, it was a warning of the future. In the months to come, the disparity would only grow. American pilots would arrive with even more hours logged, sometimes 400 or 500 before combat. German cadets, rushed through training, might barely have 50. American industry would churn out faster and deadlier fighters. German airfields would fill with inexperienced boys and machines that could not be maintained properly. What unfolded at Cape Bon was only the beginning, a glimpse of the decline of the Luftwaffe and the rise of American air supremacy. The Germans could not believe it at the time. But disbelief did not change the reality. Their system was faltering and the skies were slipping away. When the surviving aircraft finally reached Sicily and the first radio messages came through, disbelief spread across Luftwaffe command like a contagion. Reports of dozens of transports destroyed seemed too outrageous to be true. At headquarters in Rome, officers initially dismissed them as exaggerations born of panic. How could a well-escorted formation, flying its usual routes, be wiped out in less than a quarter of an hour? It defied the image of German air power they had cultivated since the earliest days of the war. And yet, as more pilots landed or failed to, the truth hardened into something no amount of denial could soften. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the man tasked with holding together the crumbling Axis position in the Mediterranean, received the confirmation grimly. His diary for that evening contained a single terse line: "Daylight transport operations have become impossible. Night flights only until further notice." In that brief sentence lay the acknowledgement of strategic collapse. Without daylight resupply, every unit fighting in Tunisia was effectively cut off from vital support. The ripples reached Berlin within hours. Adolf Hitler, informed of the disaster, erupted in fury. In his world, defeat was never the fault of structural weakness or enemy superiority, it was always the fault of cowardice or incompetence. He demanded courts-martial for the escort commanders who, in his eyes, had abandoned the transports. He accused the transport pilots of panic, of failing to maintain discipline. Orders were issued to reinforce the Mediterranean with more fighters, as though shifting paper units could reverse the material impossibility. But there were no fighters to spare. The Eastern Front was consuming every available machine and man in preparation for the looming battle at Kursk. To the men in the field, Hitler's tirades meant little. They knew the truth: the transports were flying coffins. Every crew member had seen with his own eyes how easily the Americans had torn through them. No punishment or fiery speech could change that knowledge. Among the ranks, bitter jokes spread. Soldiers mocked the lumbering Ju-52s as Easter eggs that cracked at the first touch. Others sang dark parodies about the Luftwaffe's failure to protect them. The myth of German air invincibility, so carefully nurtured since 1939, was cracking. The psychological weight was immense. For the ground forces in Tunisia, Palm Sunday was a death knell. Already squeezed by Montgomery's 8th Army from the east and American forces from the west, they had clung to the hope that supplies could still come by air. Fuel, ammunition, medical support, even evacuation for the wounded, all had depended on those transports. Now, with a single engagement, that hope vanished. They could still fight, but they knew the end was only weeks away. And indeed, less than a month later, on May 13, 1943, more than 250,000 Axis troops in North Africa laid down their arms. Palm Sunday had not single-handedly caused their surrender, but it accelerated the collapse by cutting the final threads of their supply chain. To many German officers, the link between that afternoon above Cape Bon and the mass capitulation that followed was clear. Yet the effects went beyond North Africa. Within the German High Command, the massacre forced a sobering reassessment of their enemy. For years, many officers had dismissed the Americans as inexperienced, untested, clumsy in the air. Palm Sunday shattered that illusion. Here was proof that American pilots were not only competent but superior in training, organization, and execution. Here was proof that American industry could maintain squadrons at full strength, keep them supplied, and send them into battle with confidence. What had once been dismissed as a second-rate air force had revealed itself as a machine of deadly efficiency. For the Americans, the aftermath brought vindication. The 57th Fighter Group received a Distinguished Unit Citation, and several pilots became aces in a single day. Newsreels back home played sanitized footage of the gun cameras, transports bursting into flames with titles like Easter Egg Hunt over Tunisia. The message to the public was simple: the tide of war was turning. To the pilots themselves, however, the feelings were more complex. Many remembered the sight of men bailing out of transports, of burning wrecks dotting the sea, of helpless crews firing pistols through windows. Victory was theirs, but it carried a weight. Some spoke of it later with unease. It didn't feel like fighting, one admitted. It felt like shooting cattle in a pen. In Berlin, propaganda officials struggled. At first, they attempted to deny the scale of the losses, but neutral observers and Italian allies confirmed what had happened. Then they shifted to blaming faulty equipment, treacherous Italians, or even bad weather. None of it convinced the men at the front. Eventually, the story was recast as one of heroic sacrifice, brave transport crews giving their lives to supply comrades in Tunisia. But the spin could not erase the truth: the Luftwaffe had failed. And beyond morale, there was the matter of strategy. Hitler, desperate to restore some semblance of control, diverted fighters from the Eastern Front to reinforce the Mediterranean. That decision weakened his forces just as the Red Army was preparing its counteroffensive at Kursk. Palm Sunday, in that way, echoed far beyond the Mediterranean. The resources wasted in a futile attempt to salvage the air war in Tunisia would be sorely missed on the Russian steppe. For historians, Palm Sunday stands as a turning point not only in the North African campaign but in the entire trajectory of the war. It symbolized the moment when American air power emerged fully formed, when the Luftwaffe's decline became undeniable, and when the balance of the skies shifted permanently. It was more than an ambush, more than a tactical victory. It was the visible collapse of German confidence, both in their machines and in their doctrine. The Germans had not believed it possible. But belief, as ever in war, meant nothing. The evidence lay burning on the waves of Cape Bon. The Palm Sunday Massacre was over in less than a quarter of an hour, but its echoes reverberated across the war. To the Germans, it was not simply the loss of dozens of transport planes. It was the realization that the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies, not even over its own lifelines. To the Americans, it was vindication. Proof that their doctrine, their training, and their industry had produced a fighting force capable of shaping the course of the war. The battle revealed lessons that would define modern aerial warfare. Intelligence superiority, above all, had been decisive. Ultra-intercepts had told the Allies where to be, when to be there, and how many aircraft they would face. This wasn't luck. It was the systematic exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities. The Germans never suspected their codes were broken, and so they walked into the trap fully exposed. Palm Sunday demonstrated that wars in the 20th century would not only be fought with bullets and bombs, but with information. Technology played its role just as clearly. The P-40 Warhawk was not the most glamorous fighter of the war. By 1943, some German analysts even considered it obsolete. But the Americans had adapted it, improved it, and used it to maximum effect. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, harmonized at the optimal range, tore through unarmored transports with terrifying efficiency. Its radios, reliable and clear, allowed coordination and discipline in a way German pilots could only envy. In an era when communication meant survival, the Americans had turned even their radios into weapons. Training had made the difference as well. The men of the 57th Fighter Group and the RAF's 92 Squadron were not raw recruits thrown into the air after minimal preparation. They were the products of a training system that emphasized hours in the cockpit, mastery of formation tactics, and constant drilling until combat became instinct. Against them, German pilots, though brave and experienced, were constrained by dwindling resources. Fuel shortages meant shorter training, rushed programs, and fewer hours for cadets. The quality gap, already evident, was widening by the day. Palm Sunday was only the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across Europe until the Luftwaffe was bled dry. But perhaps the most profound lesson of all was industrial. Palm Sunday was not the triumph of one brilliant pilot, nor the stroke of genius of a single commander. It was the triumph of a system, an industrial democracy that could mobilize, train, supply, and sustain. The United States had harnessed its factories, its engineers, its resources, and its young men into a war machine that was greater than the sum of its parts. In the face of that machine, German notions of superiority, of individual heroism, of ideological zeal, meant nothing. The massacre also raised uncomfortable moral questions. The German transports were legitimate targets, carrying supplies and personnel to sustain the Axis war effort. But inside those aircraft were not only soldiers but administrators, mechanics, and medical staff. Many died without ever having fired a shot in anger. For the American pilots, the mission was necessary, but some admitted afterward that it felt more like an execution than a battle. This was modern war, impersonal, efficient, and devastating. The age of duels between knights of the air was gone, replaced by systematic annihilation delivered at the speed of technology. For the Luftwaffe, Palm Sunday forced a reckoning. If they could not protect their transports in daylight, what hope did they have of defending German cities when the bomber offensive began in earnest? If American fighters could inflict such destruction in Tunisia, what would happen when they arrived over the Reich itself? The answer would come in the months and years that followed as Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Liberators darkened the skies above Germany. Palm Sunday had been a warning. Few recognized it at the time, but it marked the beginning of the end for German air power. For historians, Palm Sunday is studied as more than a battle. It is a case study in the integration of intelligence, training, technology, and industry. Modern air forces still analyze it, drawing lessons about the vulnerability of transport operations, the importance of air superiority, and the decisive power of preparation. It remains a textbook example of how overwhelming advantage can be achieved through planning rather than chance. But beyond textbooks and doctrine, Palm Sunday remains a story of men, of the German crews who climbed into their transports that afternoon expecting a routine flight home, and of the American pilots who intercepted them with ruthless precision. Within minutes, lives were ended and history was reshaped. The Germans who survived could not believe it. The Americans who returned to base knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The massacre over Cape Bon did not just win a tactical victory. It announced to the world that American air power had arrived, and that it would dominate for the remainder of the century. The Germans, shocked and disbelieving, had been forced to confront a new reality. The industrial democracy they had scorned was now the master of the skies. And so, the Palm Sunday Massacre endures as one of the most one-sided and decisive air battles in history. In less than 15 minutes, it sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean, accelerated the collapse of Axis forces in Africa, and revealed the shape of modern war. The Germans could not believe what had happened. But belief was irrelevant. The transports lay at the bottom of the sea, the survivors carried the scars, and the tide of the war had turned. That is the legacy of April 18, 1943, a day when the balance of the skies shifted forever, and when American air power proved itself not just effective but unstoppable. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think the Palm Sunday Massacre teaches us about modern air warfare? Do you believe intelligence and technology are still the deciding factors today, or have new dynamics emerged? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's most decisive air battles insightful, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. This is just one chapter of a much larger story, the rise of air power and how it shaped the outcome of the Second World War.